The cave walls sweated with moisture, the dark air thick with smoke and the sharp sting of fear. A child's palm, pressed into soot, left a smudge on the rock that glowed faintly when a shell burst outside and sent dust raining from the ceiling. In the cramped hollow, women clutched their children close, whispering prayers into hair that smelled of ash and damp earth. Every heartbeat seemed to echo louder than the artillery that shook the island, as if their own bodies betrayed them with noise. The Battle of Okinawa had turned the land into a furnace, and for the people hiding here, the cave was both womb and coffin, salvation and slow death. Yuki, no more than 7, had been told not to cry. Her mother pressed her hand hard against the child's mouth whenever footsteps or distant voices passed. "The Americans will hear," she whispered, even though the rumble of naval guns drowned nearly all sound. Yuki's eyes, wide and unblinking, held the belief that demons truly stalked the island. Her mother, Hannah, remembered the lessons drilled into them, that capture meant dishonor, suffering, and death. It was easier to believe in horror than in mercy, easier to teach a child fear than risk the consequences of hope. Around them the cave was a hive of whispers. Old men muttered that the Imperial Army would save them, though no soldiers came. Younger mothers tried to hush infants with breasts that had long since dried, their skin sagging from hunger. The air smelled of mildew and unwashed bodies, of blood that lingered in wounds left untended. Sometimes a scream pierced through the cave from those struck by shrapnel outside, but most cries never lasted long. Silence was safer than truth. Hannah carried a small grenade in her sleeve, a heavy gift from the soldiers who had marched through the village before retreating into the hills. "Better than letting the Americans touch you," they had said with grim certainty. She hated the feel of it against her skin, hated the weight of choosing between survival and the kind of death she had been told was noble. Each time she felt its round shape cold against her arm, she wondered whether it was meant to protect her or control her. Outside the island screamed. The thunder of shells crashed against the cliffs. Flames licked across the horizon, painting the night in strange hues of red and orange. Villages that had stood for centuries were ground into rubble. From time to time, Hannah could smell the sea carried in by the wind through cracks in the rock, salty and clean, mocking the staleness of their prison. She longed to step into its vastness, even if it meant drowning. In another corner of the cave, an elder named Sachiko tried to remind the huddled civilians of honor. Her voice, frail yet sharp, insisted that to be captured was shame, that the emperor demanded sacrifice. "We are petals of the cherry blossom," she said, her words trembling into the stone. "Better to fall beautifully than rot in the hands of the foreigner." Yet her hands, wrinkled and veined, trembled as she clutched her granddaughter's thin shoulders. The girl looked at her with hollow eyes, too tired to understand poetry. Time in the cave did not move forward but downward, spiraling deeper into exhaustion. Days blurred. Hunger gnawed with teeth sharper than any enemy. Rats, once feared, became prizes, caught and shared with trembling gratitude. When someone coughed too loudly, people recoiled, fearing the sound would bring death from both outside and within. Babies grew too weak to cry, and that silence frightened Hannah more than the bombs. Yet amid this suffocating darkness, moments of tenderness flickered like sparks. A neighbor tore her last scrap of cloth to bandage Yuki's blistered feet. Someone passed a hidden sweet potato around, letting each child take a bite no bigger than a fingernail. Even in their starvation, the instinct to preserve others endured. The cave was not only fear, it was also the stubborn refusal of human beings to let go of one another. Still, the enemy remained in every whispered breath. Hannah had never seen an American, yet she felt their presence like a shadow pressing in from the outside world. The soldiers had told them the foreigners would desecrate, enslave, destroy. In the darkness, it was easy to imagine claws, horns, and fire-breathing mouths waiting at the cave's mouth. To surrender was to walk willingly into hell. One evening, as artillery fell farther away, a strange stillness settled. It was not peace but a pause, like the intake of breath before a scream. Hannah listened, clutching Yuki's hand. From the entrance of the cave came a faint new sound, voices, deep and foreign, carried by the wind. The women stiffened, their bodies pressed tighter against the rock. Children's eyes widened. Someone hissed for silence. The voices grew closer, firm yet not cruel, words tumbling in a language they had never heard but feared all the same. Hannah felt her heart seize. Her fingers brushed the grenade in her sleeve. This could be the moment, shame or salvation she could not tell. Yuki clung to her arm, her small body trembling. The foreign voices echoed again, steady, deliberate, as if calling not for battle but for reassurance. It was impossible to understand the meaning, yet something in the tone, the rhythm, the absence of hatred, was different than what Hannah had been taught. Dust drifted from the ceiling as if the cave itself held its breath. The women waited, torn between terror and an ache so deep for food, for water, for an end to the darkness, that even hell seemed bearable compared to this limbo. Hannah stared at the cave's jagged mouth where faint light flickered, and for the first time the word enemy felt less certain. Something outside was coming, and it carried not only the weight of fear but the faintest possibility of mercy. The voices drew nearer. Yuki's small hand reached toward the light, trembling. Hannah could not move, her pulse hammering like the guns above. In that instant, between the darkness of the cave and the unknown beyond, she realized that everything she had been told about the enemy might shatter in the next breath. And when the shadow finally crossed the threshold, the world they thought they knew would change forever. The first sight of them came not with horns or dripping fangs but with hands lifted cautiously, palms open, as if to show they carried no weapons. The Americans stood framed against the daylight, enormous figures in mud-streaked uniforms, their helmets dented, rifles slung low. Hannah clutched Yuki so tightly the child whimpered, certain that this was the moment her life would end. Behind her, whispers spiraled into a panicked hiss, women urging silence, elders preparing themselves for the promised dishonor. The propaganda had worked too well. These men were demons in every imagination. Yet when one of the Marines reached slowly into a pouch and drew out a battered metal canteen, the terror twisted into confusion. He crouched near the cave mouth, his movements deliberate, as if aware that every motion could decide life or death. His voice came deep and strange, syllables heavy with foreignness, but his eyes, gray-blue beneath the brim of his helmet, were searching, not threatening. He held the canteen out and tipped it forward, letting the water glint in the light as it splashed onto the earth. A small gesture, but it rippled through the darkness of the cave like a shockwave. Hannah's throat tightened. Yuki stared at the water with desperate hunger, her lips cracked from days without a sip. Still Hannah hesitated. Could kindness be a trap? Then, almost against her own will, Hannah moved. She edged forward, her body trembling with each step. The Marine did not reach for her, did not lunge. He simply held the canteen steady as though offering peace itself. She took it, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The water touched her lips and she nearly sobbed. When she let Yuki drink, the child's face lit with astonishment as though tasting sunlight. No poison. No trick. Just water. Behind her, murmurs swelled. Others pressed closer, torn between dread and desperate need. The Marines beckoned gently, coaxing them out one by one. Some women collapsed immediately, their bodies too frail to carry the weight of survival. The Americans lifted them with surprising tenderness, strong arms wrapping around fragile frames. The air outside smelled of smoke and cordite, but also of open sky, and after weeks in darkness it was like stepping into another world. The soldiers tried to reassure them with gestures, pointing to their hearts, patting their chests, smiling awkwardly. Some mimed eating, then produced field rations, handing out biscuits and chocolate bars. The children bit into the strange food with wide eyes, their tongues struggling to recognize sweetness. One boy spat out chewing gum, convinced it was soap, and the Marines laughed softly, not mockingly but with a kind of fatherly amusement. For a moment, the ruins of war bent into something almost absurd. Still, fear lingered. One older woman screamed when a Marine reached for her arm, convinced he meant to drag her away. Another clutched the grenade she had hidden, her knuckles white, until an American medic knelt and gently bound the wound on her leg with his own bandage. She stared at him in disbelief, her lips trembling as he tightened the cloth and gave a nod that needed no translation. She let the grenade slip into the dirt. For the Marines, the conflict was no less bewildering. They had been trained to see every figure as a potential enemy, to expect ambush from women carrying hidden blades or children strapped with explosives. Some hesitated, rifles still raised, scanning the cliffs for snipers who might use civilians as bait. And yet, faced with hollow-eyed mothers and skeletal children, their instincts shifted. The war manuals had not prepared them for this. The enemy was not just soldiers, it was hunger, fear, and lies. Hannah watched one of the younger Marines, barely older than a boy himself, take off his helmet and place it gently on a toddler's head. The child giggled, the sound startling in its innocence. The soldier laughed too, though his face was streaked with grime and fatigue. In that moment, the idea of demons dissolved. They were men, weary men, burdened by a war that demanded destruction but who, when given the chance, reached instinctively for mercy. But the mercy was never without danger. Sniper fire cracked from the ridges, bullets zipping through the air. The Marines ducked and shielded the civilians with their own bodies, dragging them to cover, shouting in English words the Okinawans could not understand but felt in the urgency of their tone. One medic fell to the ground, blood blossoming across his back, even as the woman he had been carrying stumbled free into safety. Hannah saw it all with a heart that could not decide whether to break or to believe. These devils bled for them. The hours bled together in a strange rhythm, artillery booming in the distance, children sipping cautiously at canteens, Marines ushering more civilians from the caves. Some of the islanders still resisted, clinging to the idea that surrender was death. But each moment of unexpected kindness chipped away at the fortress of fear. A shared glance, a smile, a sip of water, they were small things, yet in the ruins of Okinawa they carried the weight of miracles. That night, when the sky burned orange with fire from the hills, Hannah sat with Yuki wrapped in her arms, a half-empty canteen resting beside them. She thought of the soldiers' faces, the hands that had carried them, the laughter that had cracked open the silence of despair. The stories they had been told, the tales of torture and slaughter, felt like shadows crumbling before the first light of dawn. Yet the dawn was still uncertain, and the war raged on beyond the horizon. As Hannah drifted into uneasy sleep, the sound of foreign voices lingered in her ears. They were not the growls of demons, but neither were they promises of safety. Somewhere in that space between enemy and savior, a new truth was forming, fragile and dangerous. For every sip of water, there was still the echo of gunfire. And in the days to come, those two realities would collide in ways no one in the caves could yet imagine. The sun rose over Okinawa not as a promise of warmth but as a cruel overseer, casting its light on smoke that curled above shattered ridges and valleys blackened by fire. The Americans advanced slowly, every footstep a wager between survival and sudden death. For Hannah and Yuki, drawn from the caves into the tenuous safety of Marine patrols, the war did not end with water or food. It followed them into every moment, lurking in the hiss of bullets that sliced the air, in the thunder of shells that seemed to split the very earth. The men who had given them bread now risked their lives not only against their enemy but to shield strangers who had been raised to fear them. One morning, as the patrol moved through a ravaged village, gunfire erupted from the hillsides. Civilians screamed, diving into the ruins. Marines dropped instantly to the dirt, forming a barrier around the unarmed. Hannah crouched low, clutching Yuki beneath her shawl, but she could see the soldiers' bodies pressed against the rubble, their rifles aimed outward, their own forms offered as shields. A boy no older than 10 broke free from his mother's grip and ran into the open, crying for his brother. A Marine sprinted after him, bullets sparking at his heels, scooping the child into his arms just as a crack split the air and blood burst from his shoulder. Still, he kept running, stumbling back to cover, pressing the boy against his chest as though life itself depended on that fragile cargo. The scene repeated in endless variations. A corpseman crawled on his belly to reach a woman who had collapsed, his medic's bag bouncing against his hip. Shrapnel tore into the earth beside him, showering him with dirt, but he never stopped binding her wound, his face calm, almost gentle, even as his own leg bled beneath his torn trousers. Another Marine lifted an old man onto his back, the civilian's arms draped around his neck, and staggered across an open field under mortar fire. The man wept into the soldier's collar, his tears mixing with the grime and sweat of a boy who had come across the ocean to kill and was now risking everything to save. Every hour blurred the line between enemy and protector. Hannah watched Yuki cling to the hand of a Marine with freckles across his nose, the girl's small fingers dwarfed by his calloused palm. She saw him wince when gunfire cracked too close, yet he never let go. He tried to teach her a word in English, safe, repeating it slowly, pointing to his chest. Yuki repeated it, her accent breaking the syllables into pieces, and he smiled with an exhaustion that carried more kindness than triumph. But mercy carried a terrible price. The Japanese soldiers hidden among the rocks did not hesitate to shoot at civilians who approached the Americans. Some Okinawans, desperate for survival, broke from the crowd and ran, only to fall to the bullets of their own supposed defenders. Hannah saw it with her own eyes. A young mother, clutching her baby, shot down as she fled toward the Marines. The baby wailed in the dust until a soldier snatched it up, pressing it against his chest with a face twisted in disbelief at the cruelty of a war that devoured its own people. The Marines themselves were not invincible. Their helmets rattled with near misses, their bodies fell heavy into the mud when bullets found their mark. Hannah counted 3 young men she had seen alive in the morning lying still by dusk, their faces slack, their hands frozen in the gestures of protection. Yet even as death cut them down, others stepped forward, filling the gaps, refusing to abandon the civilians who stumbled at their side. The land mirrored their suffering. Fields that once bore sweet potatoes were pocked with craters, their soil burned. Villages became skeletal remains, walls jagged against the horizon. The air reeked of gunpowder, of sweat, of rotting flesh. Children covered their ears when artillery roared, but the sound still lived inside their bones. At night, the sky flickered with tracer fire, unnatural constellations drawing lines of violence across the darkness. Yet even amid this relentless storm, there were moments of improbable humanity. One evening, when the guns fell silent for a brief hour, Marines tossed a battered coconut between the children, miming the rules of a game they called baseball. Yuki laughed for the first time in weeks, her voice rising above the ruins. Hana stood at the edge, watching with disbelief. For that fragile moment, the war receded. The ruins became a playground, the soldiers coaches instead of killers. The sight left Hana shaken because it revealed a truth more dangerous than propaganda. Enemies could become guardians, even friends. Still, trust was fragile. Each time a new bombardment began, the civilians flinched, wondering if protection could hold against the avalanche of destruction. Hana wrestled with the weight of her doubts. She still carried the memory of the grenade, still felt the ghost of Sachiko's words about honor. Yet she also carried the memory of a soldier's bloodied hands lifting Yuki into safety. Which truth would prevail? The old one of fear and obedience, or the new one of fragile mercy? The days stretched into a rhythm of chaos. Advance, attack, rescue, loss. The civilians followed the Marines, tethered by necessity, bound by a trust born of desperation. Hana learned to read their gestures, the tilt of a hand that meant wait, the urgency in their eyes that meant run. Yuki began to mimic their words, her voice mingling with theirs in strange harmony. Each step forward was a gamble, but it was also survival. One dusk, as the horizon bled crimson, Hana saw a Marine pause to bury a fallen child beside the road. He placed his own helmet at the grave's head, bowing his head before rejoining the march. She felt a shiver race through her. These men, sent to destroy, were binding themselves to the dead of her people with an intimacy that defied every story she had been told. And yet the battle was not over. The hills still smoked, the guns still thundered, and the promise of safety remained a distant dream. As Hana held Yuki close that night, she knew they were walking through fire beside men who bled for them, men who could vanish in an instant. Somewhere ahead, the war would demand its final price. And when that moment came, mercy alone might not be enough to save them. When the guns finally fell silent in late June, the island of Okinawa resembled a broken altar, soaked with sacrifice. Hills once green were gouged open, villages flattened into fields of ash, and the sea itself carried wreckage that bobbed like forgotten prayers. For Hana and Yuki, survival had been wrestled from chaos day by day, but now the roar of battle gave way to a new and unnerving quiet. It was in that silence that the war's strangest transformation began, not in victories or banners, but in the fragile bonds between conquerors and the conquered. The Marines, weary and hollow-eyed, did not vanish when the fighting ended. Instead, they set about erecting makeshift camps for the civilians who staggered from caves and ruins. Canvas tents flapped in the salty breeze, forming small villages of their own, places where rice pots simmered and the wounded lay on cots arranged in rows. The men who had stormed beaches now ladled soup into bowls, their rifles leaning forgotten against fence posts. For the Okinawans, it was bewildering to be fed by hands they had been told would destroy them. Yuki clung close to Hana in those first days, unwilling to release her mother's sleeve even when children her age began chasing one another between the tents. She had seen too much to believe in play. Yet when a Marine produced a packet of hard candy and pressed it into her hand, her eyes widened with the disbelief of someone holding a piece of the sun. The candy stuck in her teeth, too sweet to swallow quickly, and she laughed through tears. Hana, watching, felt her heart fracture into relief and sorrow at once. The devils of her nightmares had brought joy back to her daughter's face. Not all were so willing to accept this reversal. Some elders still muttered that survival in the enemy's care was a stain that could never be washed away. They spoke of shame, of loyalty betrayed. But their words fell thinner each day as hunger receded, as wounds closed under the careful touch of American medics. It was difficult to believe in demons when those demons stayed awake through the night to change dressings, when they shared their rations even as their own stomachs growled. Hana often watched the young Marine with freckles who had once guided Yuki through the chaos of gunfire. She learned his name was Samuel, spoken with a softness that surprised her. He carried himself with the exhaustion of someone twice his age, yet he always knelt when speaking to children, lowering his tall frame so his eyes met theirs. He tried to learn words in Okinawan dialect: thank you, eat, safe, his accent clumsy but his effort genuine. Hana found herself smiling despite herself when he butchered the syllables, Yuki correcting him with a pride that seemed to heal something in her small chest. Still, beneath the camp's surface, the war's shadow lingered. The graves stretched across the fields, neat rows of crosses and simple markers, American and Okinawan alike. Hana visited one morning and saw Samuel standing before a mound marked only with a wooden board, his cap clutched in his hands. At its base rested a sandal no bigger than Yuki's foot. He did not speak, but the grief in his stillness was enough. Hana felt a chill as she realized he carried the weight of the dead as fiercely as the living. Life in the camp began to take on its own rhythm. The Marines built small schools where children learned songs in English alongside arithmetic, their voices rising like fragile birdsongs against the backdrop of ruin. Women cooked rice in great pots, the aroma filling the air with a scent that whispered of normalcy. Even laughter returned, hesitant at first, then stronger as though testing its own endurance. Hana, once suspicious of every gesture, now found herself helping Samuel distribute supplies, her hands brushing his as they passed bowls down the line. The contact startled her each time, a reminder that the barrier between enemy and ally had grown perilously thin. Yet peace did not erase memory. Some nights, Hana woke trembling, haunted by the faces of those who had not lived to taste this reprieve. She remembered Sachiko's stern voice, insisting on honor through death, and wondered what the elder would say now if she saw her people sheltered beneath American tents. Shame and gratitude wrestled inside Hana like rival storms, neither strong enough to drive the other away. One evening, as the sky blushed purple and the air cooled, Hana sat beside Yuki near the camp's edge. The girl leaned against her, clutching a small doll made from scraps of cloth and thread gifted by one of the Marines. They watched Samuel teaching a group of children to throw a ball, his laughter ringing across the yard. For the first time in months, Hana allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow not defined by survival alone. She wondered if seeds could grow again in Okinawan soil, if the scars carved by fire could one day bear fruit. But the war had not truly ended. Rumors drifted through the camp of firebombed cities in Japan, of a weapon so powerful it could erase entire worlds. The civilians listened in silence, their fragile peace trembling with each whispered report. Hana felt the dread seep back into her chest, the knowledge that mercy could vanish as quickly as it appeared. As night fell, Samuel approached with a lantern, its glow pushing back the shadows. He offered it with a smile, gesturing for Hana and Yuki to take it. The flame lit their faces, illuminating the space between them. Hana accepted, her fingers brushing his once more, the warmth of the lantern steady in her grasp. In that small circle of light, she saw not a conqueror or a devil but a human being who had chosen, again and again, to protect rather than destroy. The lantern's glow flickered across Yuki's wide eyes as she whispered the English word Samuel had taught her, safe. The sound carried into the night like a fragile prayer. Hana held her daughter tighter, torn between the comfort of the word and the uncertainty of what lay beyond the island's shores. For though Okinawa had fallen silent, the world beyond still roared, and the fragile seeds of humanity planted here would soon face storms greater than any they had yet endured. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.